Great. Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. I guess I'm jumping ahead. I'm already thinking we're after lunch. I'm not feeling hungry. Hopefully nobody else is here. I thought we'd maybe draw this panel out a little bit. We'll do it till about 1:30 and see how that goes with the audience. But, all right, good. You're still smiling. Awesome. Hopefully the day's been great. As mentioned, I'm Stuart Dankovy, and maybe before we kick things off, we'll pass the mics across my colleagues here that are sitting with us, and ask them to do some introductions.
Hello.
You're live, Robert.
I'm live. Rob Moerman. I'm a partner with KPMG Canada in the cyber practice. I'm not a cloud security expert, to be clear to everybody. My area of focus is security operations and increasingly security operations in the cloud. So I've spent the past 20 years basically doing incident management, security operations work, helping organizations develop incident response processes, technology controls, implementation, and really what do you do when things go wrong.
Great. Brandon?
Thank you. Hey, everybody. My name is Brandon Traffanstedt. I'm one of the global directors of systems engineering for a company called CyberArk. I do dabble in cloud security. In fact, it's one of the things we've seen at the top of most folks' minds over the past, I'd say, 3 to 5 years or so. I'm also responsible for legacy technology security, so from mainframe to microservices. Quick blurb about CyberArk, we do privileged access security, so the management of incredibly powerful identities on-prem, in the cloud, just not in your refrigerator. IoT devices are something we care about, but whether or not you have milk is something that we might work into eventually.
Hello. Good. Hi, guys. This is Dhruv Chandra. I'm working with RBC, and I'm responsible for governance, compliance, and security with regards to our cloud practices. And I do believe that regardless of what we all think, if you're doing cloud, you have to think about security, no matter what we do.
Great segue. So maybe we'll start with just a little bit of background. I think we're all pretty familiar with the explosion that we're seeing, obviously, of consumption of cloud services, and probably all pretty familiar with what the business benefits are as far as time to market, being able to leverage the rapid elasticity, a lot of cost efficiencies, et cetera. But I think there's another aspect to it, right? When it comes to security and risk, these continue to come up as areas of curiosity and concern for a lot of customers, right? And I think there's a pretty big difference we're seeing in the industry of activity that happens at very large organizations that are very well funded and have a lot of security folks to assess risk and put the right controls in place, to smaller mid-sized organizations that may not have that bench or resource talent available. So I think what's interesting to get some feedback from our panel on is, based on this increased demand that we're seeing, right? Based on this explosion that we're seeing of these cloud services and SaaS offerings, hyperscale cloud providers like Azure, AWS, GCP, who provide a pretty wide array of IaaS and PaaS services. Given that not all cloud services are created equal from a security and compliance point of view, what should our audience consider as it relates to assessing your cloud providers from a security and compliance point of view? How do they help to make? How can we help them to make the right decisions when they're looking at different cloud providers in the context of security?
Loaded question, but I think before we start on the cloud journey, we have to look into what kind of regulations and other such mandated controls exist within the cloud service provider. There are technologies, and since it's Stuart, I cannot speak about any other cloud because otherwise he'll get annoyed with me. So I'm going to focus specifically on Microsoft Azure Cloud.
This is a safe place, Dhruv.
Yeah, it's a safe place.
It's a safe place.
But from a technology standpoint, from a feature standpoint, you want to look into the maturity of the cloud provider when it comes to regulations and privacy and data location and stuff like that. And Azure does have a product called Azure Trust Center, and there are other organizations, other cloud providers which have something similar. But the ease of use of those technologies, the ability to actually integrate those technologies with your current existing technologies, the simplicity of that implementation, and the transparency with which your cloud service provider actually reaches out to you, tells you what is really happening. All those things are really important when you're moving the cloud journey. That said, I believe that all the cloud service providers are, catching up with each other. And depending on your use case, you may choose one over the other, but you have to explore these feature sets and see how they best fit your environment.
Thanks, Dhruv. Rob?
Yeah, so as a security operations guy, when I look at cloud providers, I like to consider the integration, the availability of information to support the SOC mission and the objectives. So smaller providers, you need to look very carefully at what data you're going to be able to get out, and then how are you going to get that data out, and is it going to integrate with the existing tools and technologies you have in your SOC? Are you running an antiquated SIM solution that's going to be difficult to get that data down? What are the cost considerations of pulling the data out of the cloud into your SIM? How do you integrate your on-premise stuff into the cloud environment, et cetera, and the availability of resources to help you in the event that something goes wrong? Some of the larger providers now, and one of them sitting next to us here, is really making a lot of strides to kind of address that, right? So we look at not just to kind of go on one vendor or another, but acknowledging the concerns around security operations and the maturity of some of the cloud services and the things that they're bringing out right now to help clients with that problem. So if I'm running the SOC and I need to consider how I'm going to respond to an incident, how do I bring that all together in unified ways? And we're seeing a lot of really good movement and developments in that, and I'm watching it very carefully.
Great feedback. Brandon, is there anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, definitely. So before we talk sort of about trust, and I think that's been a topic that is in both of your responses, human beings are really interesting biological machines because we're built to trust. And I know on a security panel that's kind of weird to talk about, right? You should trust nothing and you should trust no one. But you're doing your due diligence and you're looking at cloud providers, whether it's the big three of the public cloud, whether you're even looking at your own internal private cloud services. There's a degree of trust that forms when you perform that due diligence. Can we get the information out? Does our cloud provider have the appropriate regulations? But what we can't do is become complacent in that trust. The cloud providers are doing their best to secure stuff that's just generally of the cloud, the plumbing, the compute, the storage. But what we can't forget about is that when you move a service, when you move an identity to the cloud, it's still your stuff. It's just on somebody else's devices. So making sure that your organization is building the appropriate security around those identities, that you're not forgetting about the non-humans, the robots, which I'll probably yak on a little bit later, is just as important as making sure cloud providers are doing what they can for security of the cloud. Security for the cloud, that's still in your wheelhouse.
And we talked about this a little bit earlier, just around the shared responsibility model of the cloud. Just because you're consuming a service doesn't absolve the organization of the responsibility for putting the right security controls and configuration in place. And I think that sometimes gets lost on us. We get excited that we get to consume a service and it's really fast and we can turn it on, but just make sure that you're turning those other dials and those other buttons. And one thing I'll mention a few times today, and I'll do it right now, is MFA. Please use MFA. Use MFA within the organization. Use MFA at your home. Use MFA everywhere, and encourage your family and friends who are likely not security practitioners or may not be to leverage MFA, especially when it comes to banking, social media, other stuff like that. Moving on, how does the approach to governance change when you start to look at cloud services versus traditional on-prem? An example, what are some of the guardrails that organizations might consider putting in place when it comes to cloud technologies? Because things do change when you start to consume in a cloud, right? You can't go touch and hug your servers at the end of the day anymore. So what are your thoughts? Brandon?
Sure. So, okay, the governance side of things, it doesn't change. You're ultimately accountable for the security of the data, but I think ensuring that the right contractual language is in place and the right agreements are in place to make sure you can get the data that you need in order to support the validation of your governance and compliance program. And again, I go back to I'm the ops guy, right? So I'm usually on the outside of the governance, meaning I'm accountable for providing the KPIs, KRIs, and metrics that support whether we're doing the right things and doing them right, whether we're safe and secure. So I would want to ensure that any application, service, or platform that I'm leveraging in the cloud is providing the metrics that are necessary for me to actually validate that the mission objectives are being met to that regard. So if I have a service provider and there's no contractual obligation or ability for me to collect that information and that data, that kind of puts me at a disadvantage. And likewise, if I don't have that data, I probably don't have a lot of the fundamental information I need in order to actually respond to an incident or an event or validate my compliance to regulatory requirements or privacy, etc.
So, Stuart, you mentioned multi-factor, And I think multi-factor has a lot of really good things to do with governance. But I mentioned the concept of robots earlier. I may be dating myself just a tinge, but does anyone remember AOL Instant Messenger? The answer is probably yes, but that's when chatbots first happened. Smarter Child. I used to have long conversations with Smarter Child, and I feel like that says something negatively or positively about me depending on who you are and what your preferences might be. But the point I'm making is, have you ever tried to talk about governance with a non-human, with an application, with a robot, with a machine? Have you tried to sort out how multi-factor could work for an automated application that's designed to scale stuff in the cloud? The answer might be, well, we thought about it, but then we realized that this machine was just so different than the people we're used to governing that we just said, yeah, we'll worry about it later. When it comes to building good practices for governance in the cloud, it's very important to not forget about the non-humans. But what I would challenge you to do is when you're building these policies and you say we must have multi-factor for humans, extend that to applications. But look for attributes that those things can use to authenticate versus just another hard-coded secret. I think it was Vishal earlier who mentioned hard-coded secrets inside of public code repositories. It happens all the time, and somehow our governance says you shouldn't do it, but developers are designed, in point, it's what they like to do, to build fast and to help you digitally transform. So always challenge the authentication metrics of the applications too. Add that to your governance plan sooner rather than later. Yes, it's a challenge, but there are many tools out there that can help you kind of wrap your head around that problem.
I think everything that needs to be said has been said. But with regards to governance, one of the few things we look into is how often do we review the SOC 2 Type 2 reports, and how often do we get them? Does it actually capture all the requirements that we have with regards to our mandates and our regulations? That's something else we do. But apart from that, one of the few things that I've seen change in the technology front is we used to do batch processing when we used to do governance, risk, and compliance. And today that is that will not suffice. So what we've started doing is we have started automating most of the things. What we are trying to achieve, and what all the cloud service providers do provide, is continuous auditing, monitoring, risk assessment, and risk management. And again, there are a plethora of tools that you can use, but you have to use them because things come up and go out in a cloud space in an instance. And if you don't get visibility on it, you may actually miss out on a lot of things.
That's a great point, and I actually just want to add on that, especially for the larger cloud providers out there that you're dealing with, at least I can comment from a Microsoft point of view, there are a plethora of resources available. Like, we don't want security to be an afterthought. We're building it into the platform, we're building into the products that customers can consume, but we're also building in other capabilities that you don't have to subscribe to or pay for, right? So we've got the concept of things like Azure Blueprints, to be able to create templates and blueprints for different security or compliance use cases, and help to short circuit some of the effort that's required. So I think the more opportunity there is to work with your cloud provider or investigate what types of tools they may have to help you address these compliance questions. And it could be from a couple of angles. It could be from the angle of, how does the organization themselves, the cloud provider, take care of these controls and requirements? What's their SOC auditing report like? What's their ISO report like? And how compliant are they to the things that they say they're going to be doing? Trust but verify. But it's also an opportunity to take a look a little bit deeper and look at what other controls may be available, to yourselves to be able to implement across these services. That kind of leads me to the next question. On the flip side, cloud-powered security today, we know it's raising the cost for attackers, that's out there today. And we know that attackers are obviously using cloud capabilities, to harness them as well to go after their targets. But what's your opinion on, and let's discuss a little bit more around how security and cybersecurity organizations are raising the cost for attackers in today's cloud-powered world and empowering the security operations center within the organization?
So I'll start on that one. When we look at cloud-based security services, the piece of advice I would give you is use them. Of course, right? Security as a service makes a lot of sense. It actually helps switch the security story from on-prem, old school, network-based security, perimeter-based security to something that has no perimeter. But when you're approaching the security as a service, do so with a certain degree of equanimity. The reason I say that is I'm a millennial. I'm fairly happy about it. Some folks might not dig it so much because of how efficient millennials are from time to time. But as a millennial, if given the choice to compromise an on-prem environment versus being able to compromise assets that are in the cloud that could be accessible from the comfort of my mom's basement. Now, I promise you, I do not live in my mom's basement. I moved out last week, but of course I'm going to choose the latter, right? I'm going to go with the path of least resistance. And when we make things publicly available, that path becomes wider. So while you're using these security services, and by all means, as I mentioned, use them, scaffold the security. Make sure multi-factor is enabled for these environments. Make sure you're using the awesome tools that Microsoft has provided for site-to-site VPN communicativity between your environment and the security tool. But we talked about trust earlier. We must trust but verify. Scaffolding security is the great way to go. Don't change the tried and true security practices you're comfortable with just because we're now consuming something as a service.
That's some great feedback, absolutely. The control requirements, still remain in place. Rob or Dhruv?
Sure. I'm a big fan of the kind of integrated intelligence view that you can get within the cloud, and based on that, making decisions, but also the speed with which you can either implement mitigations or remediation plans. So it's no longer, I got to go through a firewall change review process locally and get a bunch of people on the call. You can have pre-established response plans that say we're going to do this, and it's literally just a click of a button in the cloud environment to black hole an entire subnet or something else that, based on solid intelligence, is an attacker or a threat. Likewise, resetting an infrastructure is now, a click of a button, as opposed to rolling out a bunch of tapes that may or may not work from an infrastructure somewhere buried in a data center somewhere. So I'm a big fan of that. Also, the identification of threat actors and the intelligence and the availability of those feeds directly into the cloud environments, and some of the tools like Sentinel and CloudWatch and others that are now coming up to take advantage of that. To allow you to act quickly on the information as it relates to the entire infrastructure, whereas a traditional managed services provider may have or an internal security operations capability has a limited set of indicators and has to determine the applicability of those indicators to their environment and their services, where the cloud providers can kind of realistically say, well, we know what's in our environment and we know what indicators make most sense, and those are automatically deployed in your environment to aid in your detection and response capabilities.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially when you look at hyperscale clouds of having a lot of that automation capability built in. It's the only way that we can operate these types of environments, obviously, with massive amounts of automation. But it's also, a capability for defenders today as well. Like you talk about some of the automated capability at the click of a button. We're finding more technologies that are available in market today as well to help organizations defend have automated response capability built into them, whether it's for email hygiene or endpoint security or otherwise. Given that 96% of malware is polymorphic, you need a better way to respond to things. Traditional guards, gates, and guns don't work. They're important, and traditional AV and firewalls and gateway solutions are important, but they're not going to have an impact on today's economy the way that we have such a digital identity these days. You need different approaches, obviously, in order to manage that. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, but identity is the modern control plane is something that we talk about quite a bit with customers.
So
Dhruv?
auto-healing or auto-remediation, and you've already spoken about it, but one thing what we are trying to do is elevating the eyes on glass issue, right? Because it's no longer valuable to have these 6 SOC people looking at a large screen and trying to figure out what's really happening. That creates a lot of toil, that creates a lot of overwork. What we should be doing is we should be actually automating everything, and there are technologies that you can use like functions, playbooks, runbooks, which will actually auto-heal your environment or auto-remediate your environment without even much intervention. And when something does go bad and the system is incapable of doing it, at that point of time you will get alerts or time to actually start acting on it, because otherwise the amount of alerts being generated within the cloud space is so tremendous that most of the technologies that I've played with in some other organizations, and I see some of my friends from other banks, they don't cope up. They just die halfway through. So that's what we are trying to do.
Mind if I add one thing to it, please? The concept of auto-remediation has become incredibly important, as you heard, in a more automated world. Now, many of you sitting out there may have thought, security vendor in my mind, I really wish they offered this type of automated self-healing. Speaking purely from a vendor standpoint, CyberArk learned very quickly that automation was the way to go. It gave first responders actually time to, firstly respond to stuff, but it also meant we could say, hey, by the way, this thing happened. We remediated it using this method, but still check it out. My request, and I realize that you don't owe me anything, but if I could ask for a favor, for these security vendors you work with, challenge them to build in automated remediation or move. It's possible, right? There are more vendors than ever. The last thing I'll mention is take advantage of your open source tooling and the security controls they're building in too for automated remediation. 3 weeks ago, Ansible released Ansible Security Automation at Ansible Fest in the States. Folks have already begun using that and hooking that to the existing solutions they have in place, whether it be email security, whether it be network devices, whether it be privileged access security. And we're going to see this happen more and more. And it's because you continue to challenge us to become better. So please don't allow that to stop.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of innovation these days, and I think what's really cool to see in the cloud world is, as much opportunity as it brings us, it also helps us to get to market faster. So from a security point of view, we're seeing things that might traditionally have come out in a release, 6 months or a year or 2 years later for the next version of, 2015 or 2020 or 2022 of X software package, the ability to iterate much quicker from a security point of view as well. And I think that's really helping organizations today is because the fabric that you're using in the service and the cloud service is constantly updated. So you've got that protection built in and the ongoing surveillance from that cloud service provider as well. Again, they're not all created equal, so you've got to do your due diligence and find out to what degree are they actually helping to safeguard your information and what requirements do you have as a customer in order to help safeguard your customer information. Before we turn over to some Q&A, I just wonder if I could open it up. Maybe we'll open up the floor, but thoughts for the industry. Any sort of top tips that you might have or recommendations to the audience around best practices from a cyber safe or cybersecurity point of view. MFA is part of my contribution, but certainly happy to add more. I just think there's such an opportunity to help educate the broader market, on best practices there. It's great at a forum like this to be able to share.
Well, so again, as a SOC guy, as the guy who's called in the middle of the night, try to put out a fire when something goes wrong. Whether you're using infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, if you put an application in there, make sure it's got the right data in it that somebody can act on it in the event of a breach or an incident. I have had incidents where I was called in to assist with cloud application and insecure S2 or something else, but the logging at the application layer was not available to actually support the investigation and understand the scope of the incident. So I guess what I'm saying is the advanced techniques require the basics mastered. When you're talking about a cloud environment, you're essentially talking about somebody else's computer in somebody else's data center. So it doesn't automatically remove the requirement for you to exercise the proper hygienes, whether it's an application security or an integration with your existing governance processes. It's still there. It's just somebody else has responsibility for the execution of a smaller piece of that. So don't think that because it's in the cloud, everything is okay, and I don't think many of you do, but some folks do tend to overlook some of the basics and just make sure that you're actually following your application development life cycles appropriately and integrating with security before you go to the cloud so you understand what you're going to do if and when something goes wrong.
It's a great point, and I'm super happy that you touched on consistent logging and telemetry because those are critical, whether you're dealing with an incident or whether or not you've got some auto-remediation capability in the environment, you still want to have that telemetry to be able to do that investigation and get to root because there might be another issue that's percolating up that you may not just have picked up on yet.
So one of my pet peeves is that with regards to cloud adoption, one of the few things I have seen again and again happen is within the cloud expertise that exists in any organization, there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of development, but it fails in comparison with the lack of knowledge that exists around that cloud team. So here we are trying to improve the cloud team to deliver the best of the breed, but when you go to auditors, they will ask you questions that short circuit your entire process. When you go to the Data office teams, they have no clue how you're trying to deal with data or controls around data. When you go to the risk and governance team, they have none of that information. So that lack of understanding actually slows the entire cloud adoption within the organization. And one of the things that we are trying to do is, and interestingly enough, I actually had a conversation with a gentleman called Raj Binnings, who's a part of Microsoft. And not only are we actually educating the entire organization, but we are actually taking some of our key stakeholders and key stake partners, including the business partners, and educating them with regards to the cloud, so that we collectively can move in one direction rather than one small silo moving into one direction while everybody else tries to pull them down. So one of my top tips would be, if you're moving into cloud, start educating everybody within the cloud area.
Let me jump on that for a second.
Of course.
So I would add to that when you're looking at cloud providers and potential cloud providers, try to look for those that speak an audit language or framework that your internal organizational controls understand. So try to map your compliance program to whatever standard you're using. Look for one that will support that externally. So whatever your framework, if you're already speaking the same language, it's easier for your auditors to have some comfort because they understand the risks and controls that are being measured and how they're being measured. Anyway.
So my response to the query is going to be a little fluffy. Hope that's okay. How many developers are in the room? Any developers? So we're attending an event on a Saturday at a panel that's talking about cloud security after a session talking about cloud governance and risk. Developers. Now, for those of you who aren't on the development side, would this have happened 2, 3, 4 years ago? Maybe, maybe not. But we actually are seeing folks who are dev-minded actually caring about the stuff that many of us have made our careers on the governance sides of things. To me, that's amazing. And what I implore you to do is to continue that culture, the culture of cooperation, the culture of education. In many cases, when an organization begins their move to the cloud, it happens from the top. So C-level goes to a conference, looks around, and sees the word cloud everywhere, and they say, cloud. We got to do that. So we take it to the dev team and the architecture teams, and we say, do cloud. And then later we go to security and governance and risk, and we say, hey, can you look at that thing that they did? And then you look at it. But why go that approach? Begin communicating with your dev teams today. The applications that you know are moving to the cloud, talk to them. Take them out for lunch. Take them out for ice cream. I'm not sure if you want to get ice cream right now, but take them out for something. Design a communications mesh that allows for the innovation to continue to occur. Because let's face it, devs spent their Saturday coming here with the rest of us. That's commendable. Let's not lose track of that because we're looking at two teams with potentially different goals. We all want to enable the organization, but sometimes it just starts with a conversation. What you'll find as you continue looking deeper into the security of the cloud aspects is many folks will have kind of two opinions. At DEF CON 2 years ago, someone stood up in Sky Talks as a presenter and said, we need to slow our developers down. No, we need to become faster, more agile, and more open ourselves. And I think that mentality change, more than technology, more than additional oversight, that gets us pointed in the right direction. So buy pizza for your developers. You can enjoy some too. It's a great idea.